I. Paul Manafort's two campaign period meetings with Konstantin Kilimnik in the United States. Manafort twice met with Kilimnik in person during the campaign period, once in May and again in August 2016. The first meeting took place on May 7, 2016, in New York City. In the days leading to the meeting, Kilimnik had been working to gather information about the political situation in Ukraine. That included information gleaned from a trip that former Party of Regions official Yuri Boyko had recently taken to Moscow, a trip that likely included meetings between Boyko and high-ranking Russian officials. Kilimnik then traveled to Washington, D.C. on or about May 5, 2016. While in Washington, Kilimnik had pre-arranged meetings with State Department employees. Late on the evening of May 6th, Gates arranged for Kilimnik to take a 3 a.m. train to meet Manafort in New York for breakfast on May 7th. According to Manafort, during the meeting, he and Kilimnik talked about events in Ukraine, and Manafort briefed Kilimnik on the Trump campaign, expecting Kilimnik to pass the information back to individuals in Ukraine and elsewhere. Manafort stated that opposition bloc members recognized Manafort's position on the campaign was an opportunity, but Kilimnik did not ask for anything. Kilimnik spoke about a plan of Boyko to boost election participation in the eastern zone of Ukraine, which was the base for the opposition bloc. Kilimnik returned to Washington, D.C. right after the meeting with Manafort. Manafort met with Kilimnik a second time at the Grand Havana Club in New York City on the evening of August 2, 2016. The events leading to the meeting are as follows. On July 28, 2016, Kilimnik flew from Kiev to Moscow. The next day, Kilimnik wrote to Manafort requesting that they meet using coded language about a conversation he had that day. In an email with a subject line, quote, "black caviar," end quote, Kilimnik wrote, "I met today with the guy who gave you your biggest black caviar jar several years ago. We spent about 5 hours talking about his story, and I have several important messages from him to you. He asked me to go and brief you on our conversation. I said I have to run it by you first, but in principle, I am prepared to do it. It has to do about the future of his country and is quite interesting." Manafort identified, quote, "the guy who gave you your biggest black caviar jar," end quote, as Yanukovych. He explained that in 2010, he and Yanukovych had lunch to celebrate the recent presidential election. Yanukovych gave Manafort a large jar of black caviar that was worth approximately $30,000 to $40,000. Manafort's identification of Yanukovych as, quote, "the guy who gave you your biggest black caviar jar," end quote, is consistent with Kilimnik being in Moscow, where Yanukovych resided, when Kilimnik wrote, quote, "I met today with the guy," end quote, and with the December 2016 email in which Kilimnik referred to Yanukovych as, quote, "BG," end quote. Redacted, grand jury. Manafort replied to Kilimnik's July 29th email, quote, "Tuesday, August 2 is best, Tuesday or Wednesday in New York City," end quote. 3 days later, on July 31, 2016, Kilimnik flew back to Kiev from Moscow, and on that same day wrote to Manafort that he needed, quote, "about 2 hours," end quote, for their meeting, quote, "because it is a long caviar story to tell," end quote. Kilimnik wrote that he would arrive at JFK on August 2 at 7:30 p.m., and he and Manafort agreed to a late dinner that night. Documentary evidence, including flight, phone, and hotel records, and the timing of text messages exchanged, confirms the dinner took place as planned on August 2. As to the contents of the meeting itself, the accounts of Manafort and Gates, who arrived late to the dinner, differ in certain respects, but their versions of events, when assessed alongside available documentary evidence and what Kilimnik told business associate Sam Patton, indicate that at least 3 principal topics were discussed. First, Manafort and Kilimnik discussed a plan to resolve the ongoing political problems in Ukraine by creating an autonomous republic in its more industrialized eastern region of Donbas, and having Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president ousted in 2014, elected to head that republic. That plan, Manafort later acknowledged, constituted a, quote, backdoor and, quote, means for Russia to control eastern Ukraine. Manafort initially said that if he had not cut off the discussion, Kilimnik would have asked Manafort in the August 2 meeting to convince Trump to come out in favor of the peace plan, and Yanukovych would have expected Manafort to use his connections in Europe and Ukraine to support the plan. Manafort also initially told the office that he had said to Kilimnik that the plan was crazy, that the discussion ended, and that he did not recall Kilimnik asking Manafort to reconsider the plan after their August 2 meeting. Manafort said, redacted grand jury, that he reacted negatively to Yanukovych sending, years later, an, quote, urgent, end quote, request when Yanukovych needed him. When confronted with an email written by Kilimnik on or about December 8, 2016, however, Manafort acknowledged Kilimnik raised the peace plan again in that email. Manafort ultimately acknowledged Kilimnik also raised the peace plan in January and February 2017 meetings with Manafort, redacted grand jury.